Access to Democracy is made possible by donations from the following organizations. Thomson Reuters, a global company with expertise and insight to unravel complex situations in the areas of law, tax, compliance, government, and media. Their worldwide network of journalists and editors keep customers up to speed on relevant global events. Thomson Reuters, The Answer Company. Crutchfield Dermatology, a full-service treatment center and Medi-Spa in Eagan. Their goal is to help you look good and feel great with beautiful skin. With service built around courtesy, dignity, and respect, Mayo-trained Dr. Charles Crutchfield personally treats each patient and is acknowledged as one of the nation's best physicians. The Minnesota Twins are looking forward to another great season in 2023, led by the return of All-Stars Carlos Correa and Brian Buxton. With the return of numerous players who were injured in 2022 and some new acquisitions, another division crown and a return to the World Series are in their sights. Established in 2007, 45th Parallel Spirits was among the first 50 micro-distilleries in the United States. Based in New Richmond, Wisconsin, all aspects of production occur at our facility. If you're interested in visiting and learning more about the 45th Parallel Distillery, please check our website and plan a visit to tour our facility and taste our spirits. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has proudly served its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org.
Welcome to another edition of Access to Democracy. I'm Steve Francisco, your host today. It's a real pleasure to welcome to our studio, after a long absence, a return visitor, Skip Humphrey, who has one of the most famous names in Minnesota politics. Skip, welcome to Access to Democracy, or I should say, welcome back to Access to Democracy.
Well, thank you, Steve.
So I want to ask you, actually, before we get into it, I'd like to share a brief tribute with our viewers, and I'm sure you'd like to join me. Dave Durnberger, who served Minnesota in the United States Senate for many years, had a very distinguished career, became a renowned expert on healthcare policy, and really represented Minnesota well.
Yes.
In the United States Senate, passed away recently, and we just want to take a moment, and I'm sure you join me in paying tribute to him and thank him for his public service.
I attended his funeral, and it was a wonderful celebration to see the strong bipartisanship that was there, the people from all political sides, obviously there to honor his work. Particularly in the healthcare field.
Right.
And I remember meeting David. We worked together on the Citizens League. He was a leader of the Citizens League that brought about many of the changes in the metropolitan area here in the Twin Cities area.
And wouldn't you agree, Skip, that it seems like Dave Durnberger is one of a breed of Republicans who have pretty much vanished from the scene in our politics these days? Well, and when I say that, I mean that he was a moderate Republican.
That's correct.
Who reached out to work across the aisle with Democrats.
Yes.
And I saw this firsthand as a young congressional staffer myself during my time in Washington when he was in the U.S. Senate.
Sure.
But it's unfortunate that we don't have more people like Dave Durnberger in our politics today.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, and he represents, I think, a very good example of how you can have differences of opinion, but at the same time honor the work that needs to be done and to get the job done.
That's right.
And, I mean, he was very successful at his work. And so he represented, I think, some of the best of Minnesota.
I'd agree.
Let's put it that way.
And tell me what it's like. I think one thing some of our viewers might be curious about, you had an interesting childhood because of who your father was. Your father, Hubert Humphrey, was mayor of Minneapolis, served long time in the U.S. Senate, was vice president of the United States, and in 1968 came very close to being elected president of the United States.
Right.
Say a word or two. What was it like growing up as the son of a person who was in the public spotlight all of his adult life?
Well, just try and keep it compact. The fact is, we had a wonderful family life. Dad was able to not only have the public life that he enjoyed and was very successful at, but at the same time growing up, we had a pretty much normal kind of growing up. I mean, even when we were living down in Washington, D.C. during the school year time, Mom would always bring us home. Home was Minnesota. The house we lived in maybe was in the D.C. area, but home was Minnesota. And so we would come home every spring, late spring, early summer. And but in the meantime, that idea of both a public life and a private life, and at the same, and really enjoying it and having it mesh. And I had some unique experiences of not only having a great growing up time, but opportunities that perhaps others might never have. So
I imagine your father was so busy much of the time it was tough to find time to see him.
Well, that's true, but I never felt like he wasn't there. We got notices from him, little telegrams, telephone calls, and he made sure that we got involved in some of the things. My first overseas trip was with my father. Actually, yes, it was.
Where was that to?
Well, I'm trying to think, was it my first one or not? The first time I went with him was to a international conference in Europe. And it was a World Food Conference. And he was attending there. And after that, he said, well, we're close enough. You and I are going to go to see Israel and to meet Golda Meir. So we flew off to see Golda Meir. You know, it was an intriguing time, but there are so many other opportunities as well. And then just growing up in the D.C. area, my mother was, she loved to travel and to tour, and so I got to see a lot of the events and a lot of the places, locations in the East Coast area in particular.
And, you know, in tribute to your mother, too, we should mention, in case some of our viewers don't remember this, there may be younger people who don't even know this, she was a U.S. Senator, too. After your dad passed away, she was appointed and served out the remainder of his term. And wasn't she the first woman to serve as a U.S. Senator? We had a woman representative, Koya Knutson, in the House. But wasn't she the first woman
She
U.S.
may very
Senator?
well have been. I'm
was.
sorry that I can't verify that, but I never thought of it that way.
And I had the pleasure of meeting your mother when I was just a teenager, and she was just a great lady. made this gangly young kid from South Minneapolis feel right at home. At the State Fair, we were handing out her recipes for something at the DFL booth.
There's stories about the State Fair. We'd get all excited because Dad said, we're going to the fair. All right, fine. You know how far we went with Dad at the State Fair? There was a drinking fountain just outside the DFL booth. That's about as far as you got with Dad. But thank goodness Mom was there. She'd grab us and we went and saw the whole rest of the fair.
Got to go on the rides. And
the
see
rides,
the
saw all the cattle and the chickens and the pigs, the hogs and whatever.
Skip, so let's shift focus to your career. You've had an interesting career in public service in your own right. You've had a long career. You served in the Minnesota Senate from 1973 to 1983. You served as Attorney General of the state of Minnesota from 1983 to, was it 1999? Is that correct?
Well, end of 1998.
End of 98. And then, of course, you made a run for governor, came up a little bit short there. But I want to ask you about that. I want to ask specifically about your time as Attorney General. You and I both know this, and many Minnesotans do. That office, the Office of Attorney General of Minnesota, has a long reputation as being the people's attorney, protecting Minnesotans, protecting our environment, protecting consumers. Say a little bit, if you would, about what your office did during your tenure to protect Minnesotans as the people's attorney.
Well, there are any number of things. First of all, I need to acknowledge, I entered that office after Warren Spanis had served for at least a couple of terms there.
Right.
And he had pulled together an absolutely top-notch, talented group of people, many of whom I knew because many of them were either law classmates of mine or right around that time at the University of Minnesota Law School. But I have to acknowledge, I inherited a wonderful team. And I hope I led them correctly in the way. I tried to use my experience as a state legislator, figuring out what kind of policies could impact consumers and protect citizens. And at the same time, to acknowledge and to work closely with people who really had an understanding of both agency law practice and litigation practice, whether it was criminal or civil. So it was a very unique time, and to this day I run across folks that say it was a great time we had together. We really worked as a team. And in some of the areas that you were talking about, they're still very much in the front of us today. The questions of, for instance, in this new era of the change in climate, sometimes there are claims being made by industry that sometimes are a little, let's just say, beyond reality. And the Attorney General's office has a responsibility to see that consumers are protected from fraud or deception or whatever. In the areas of the medical arena, there's all sorts of things that are taking place. I was very honored to be part of a key litigation with the tobacco industry, against the tobacco industry, to open up what unfortunately they were hiding and to help people realize that there was a different way of living. And I just realized once again how dramatic that was just the other day in seeing how many people, first of all, they stand out if they're still smoking, and very few of them are still smoking. They're standing away from places where you would go in to shop or anything, and I can remember you'd go in and people were smoking in all of the stores and everything else at the time.
Everywhere, and on airplanes.
Right,
you know.
and then when you think of the number of people's lives who have been affected positively, who basically are living longer lives because of that, that was a major, major fight, and it was not only a legal fight, it was a political fight. Because
I'm glad you're mentioning the tobacco industry, Skip, because that is one of the highlights of your career. I want to drill in a little bit further on that. In 1998, there was something called a Master Settlement Agreement. It was reached with 52 state and territory attorneys general across the country. But I understand, and correct me if this is wrong, but I understand Minnesota actually reached its own settlement with the largest tobacco companies before the Master Settlement Agreement. Tell us, how did that come to be? How was Minnesota and a couple of other states able to get an agreement with them before the bigger settlement?
Well, it was, first of all, I have to acknowledge again here, it's partnerships. It's working with unbelievably talented, dedicated people. You know, Mike Ciresi,
he's been
Roberta
a guest on
Walburn,
the show.
the two of them and their team, along with the team at the AG's office. Some attorneys general in the various states, they have relatively small staff and inexperienced staff with really complex cases. In our situation, we have many people who have very great talent, even in the criminal justice field. The real question is, do we allocate those resources in a separate kind of case and take them away from the other responsibilities that the office had at the time, or do we partner with someone who can help us? And that's exactly what we did with Mike Ciresi, Roberta Walburn, and their law firm. We partnered with them as an active partnership. And frankly, we were able to break, and Minnesota was the leading state that broke through the the cases and the information that was being hidden by the tobacco industry. I mean, the tobacco industry knew a long time before others did that this was a very dangerous deadly product.
And they worked to conceal it,
yes,
to conceal that information from people.
The bottom line is we made a settlement literally in the last 45 minutes of the case.
Oh my goodness!
And the amount of money was very significant. It continues today. It will continue forever as long as any product is sold in Minnesota. There will be a continued support from the companies based on that settlement.
We should mention, just to flesh this out a little more, that this settlement agreement with Big Tobacco basically put bans on certain types of advertising, promotions, marketing targeted to young people, stopping industry practices that were minimizing the healthcare risks of their product, and probably a lot more.
Well, I'm sure you remember, and I'm sure your viewers remember Joe Camel and the Joe Camel ads. Well, you don't see them anymore.
No, you don't. And it's because of this agreement.
Yes, but what is most important with this agreement was that it opened up not only for Minnesota and for the country, but globally, this case was able to have its worldwide impact, and it's still continuing to have that impact. There are countries and litigators who will come to the state of Minnesota to look at the documents that are here. There were so many documents that we had to establish a depository outside of London, England, because it would have been too expensive to ship them all back. So for years there was an established place outside of London where there were literally millions of documents.
Wow,
so
remarkable.
It was a huge case, and in my view, and I guess the one thing that I feel very good about it is I help people have a better life, to live a healthier, better life. And to be honest about it, I just enjoy the fact that there's not a whole lot of smoke around.
Yeah. You know, it's really a remarkable thing when you think of it. As I recall, when the litigation against Big Tobacco began in the U.S., there were many, many people who said, you're going to lose. You're never going to win against Big Tobacco. They're too big to beat in court. And what you proved was, of course, that wasn't true. And it actually makes me wonder about another industry that's in the news lately, the guns and ammunition manufacturers. Many people have said the same thing about them, that, oh, you can't defeat the big gun industry when we see this proliferation of weapons of war on our streets that are killing people, that are endangering law enforcement and average citizens.
Well, I pray and hope that we can do something about that. Now, I grew up knowing and learning about hunting pheasants, particularly with my father. He was a very good shot. You know, shotguns and being out in the farmland and doing it properly, but being very safe and everything else. But you're right, this is a parallel. One of the things that happened with the tobacco industry, and may have some parallels to the way in which the gun manufacturers have dealt with legislation, is we not only had to deal in direct litigation in the courtroom, but my colleagues, many of them, and when I say my colleague AGs, many of them, again, were not going to be able to litigate to the extent that we were doing it, and so they were more than willing to accept certain conditions that were offered by the industry and to settle that way. Now, the problem with the settlement was, and I can remember standing out all by myself with no other AGs next to me. The problem with the settlement was that there was a paragraph in there that said that all future lawsuits will be banned and all current lawsuits, of which there was only one, Minnesota. And that's why I could not agree with that, and we did not agree with it, and we were able to hold it off. So in the meantime, so we had to not only fight in the courtroom, we had to really go to Congress and make sure that
they didn't undercut you.
Yeah, that they really didn't undercut, and so it was a
we should
it was a
remind.
battle royal.
I'm sure it was, and I think we should remind people that this was an industry that distributed literally millions and millions of dollars in cash to politicians, both in Washington and in the state capitals. And so you're not only having a fight against the tobacco industry to get them to do what's right, but also, you know, these other issues. So.
But I want to make sure that you understand that my colleague AGs really did do a good job. And Congress did the right thing. So we now have a much more tobacco-free society in which we're living in. Now, that isn't to say that we don't have problems, because many of these same companies now are deep into the vaping.
Yeah, and, electronic cigarettes and all.
And so we have not only that, we have these environmental concerns about making sure that citizens have accurate information so that they can make proper choices. And there's any number of other things, but that's for another Attorney General, and I've just enjoyed it.
Well, I think it's a remarkable case, and I think it's one that academics will probably be studying for a long time to come because of what was achieved here. And by the way, tell us how some of that tobacco settlement money is used, Skip.
Well, it basically comes to the state of Minnesota and is appropriated at the discretion of the legislature. At the time, I was hoping that we would establish a foundation, a health foundation, in which the billions of dollars that were, or the millions of dollars that were appropriated and the continuing inflow of money would be put in. But that did not happen. But you know, it's something that is still there, still ongoing, and it's something to be, I suppose, to be proud of. But the fact is, the people of Minnesota need to be proud of it. They were the leaders of this, and they strongly supported the effort.
Excellent. 1998, we have to touch on that. You found yourself the DFL nominee for governor of Minnesota in a three-way race.
Right.
Norm Coleman, the former mayor of St. Paul.
And then this fellow,
and
Jesse,
then this fellow who was the mayor of, what was it, Maple...
No, it was
one of the northwest suburbs.
Brooklyn Center,
Brooklyn Center, I believe, or Brooklyn Park.
I think it was Brooklyn Park.
Brooklyn Park.
It may have been.
Jesse Ventura.
Yes.
And as we know, you were in a very tight race and a very competitive race. You had numerous debates that were aired all over Minnesota. And when Election Day came, Minnesota sort of shocked the country and the world and elected this ex-professional wrestler governor of Minnesota. Say a word about that campaign, if you would.
Well, you know,
what you remember about it now, looking back 25 years. To the extent that I can remember much of the campaign, I mean, it was like any other campaign. It was pretty directly at you. You know, that you had good competitors, and Jesse was there. I think he was a bit surprised that he won. I know that his wife was very surprised that he won. But the reality is that things, you know, sometimes the good Lord just says, you know what, you're going to go in a different direction. So you need to accept what the people have decided. Yeah. And in a three-way race, it's always a bit of a challenge, to say the least. And frankly, for me, it was very fortunate, personally. I think I could have served well as governor, but that was not to be. And you know, in politics, you need to represent people well, and then you need to listen to what the people have decided. Right. You were, it's very gratifying to hear that you have that attitude toward it all these years later, because you were consistently elected to office with big majorities, especially your tenure as Attorney General. So it had to have been difficult, but like you say, when one door closes, another one opened. That's a good transition to the next part of your resume. We're down to less than 5 minutes. But you went into academia after that. You taught at the Kennedy School at Harvard University. You were a senior fellow at the University of Minnesota. Tell us a little bit about your teaching experience and how that rejuvenated you.
It was absolutely wonderful. I'm telling you, we have some of the most talented, wonderful students in this state, in this country. And the opportunity to teach. Now, frankly, I was asked by the head of the Division of Epidemiology to teach. And I thought, well, first of all, I better make sure I know how to spell epidemiology. And I asked him, I said, well, you know, Professor, why are you asking me to do this? I'll be happy to help you if I can, but why me? He said, and he was showing me, he said, you see all these books on this shelf? Yeah. And there were just a solid row of thesis books. He said, those are thesis books of very, very bright, brilliant students that no one will ever read. He said, what I want you to do is to help these students get their thesis books off this shelf and put them on the desks of legislators, of policymakers, so that we can make a difference in the health of people. And I said, well, I think I can do that. Wow. I mean, it was a unique kind of situation.
That's a wonderful challenge to have. We should mention, too, that you've served as Minnesota chapter president for AARP. We've had the AARP on this program previously. You served on the national board. 2011 comes along, and you find yourself at the Office of Older Americans working with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
Yes,
say a word about that.
The CFPB.
Really quickly. Right.
Well, I was their first assistant director. It's a very special office. It's got its own statutory authority within what we called the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And it's set up to help ensure that older Americans are protected in the consumer decisions and in the financial decisions that they have to make as they make that transition from full-time work to part-time work, the investments that they've been working on. And so that's essentially it. And it was, once again, an absolutely wonderful opportunity to work with some of the most talented people I have ever met.
Wow. That seems to be a recurring theme throughout your career. You've had a lot of good people
Well,
been blessed
I've been very fortunate.
Yeah.
I've been very fortunate.
Skip, I want to end. We're getting down to the last 2 minutes here, less than 2 minutes. I want to ask you, we live in a country right now that seems to be very divided. As a young man, you grew up in a divided era. The Vietnam War was going on. There was divisions over civil rights and a very turbulent time in America's history. We're seeing a turbulent time right now with political division in our country, challenges to our very democracy. I'm going to ask you real quickly, about a minute left. Are you an optimist or a pessimist about America's future?
Oh, I'm an optimist. This country can do whatever it wants, when it wants to do. There are wonderful people all throughout this country. And to be honest about it, yes, there's deep divisions in some respects, but you know what? When you ask the average citizen, do you want to have this work this way? Can we help you do this? Is there a way that you need some assistance there? There are positive answers all the way around.
We're closer, maybe closer than we think.
Yeah, we really are.
Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective. Skip Humphrey, former state senator, former attorney general of Minnesota, longtime public servant. Thank you for your career. Thank you for everything you've done for the people of Minnesota, and especially thank you for being on Access to Democracy.
Thank you.